Hi everyone, you're very welcome to this seminar at Trinity College Law School. So my name is Donna Lyons, I'm with the School of Law, and we're talking to Professor Jack Balkin from Yale Law School today. So we're very excited to have this opportunity. Professor Balkin is Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School. He's founder and director of Yale's Information Society Project, an interdisciplinary centre that studies law and new information technologies. He also directs the Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression and the Knight Law and Media program at Yale, and is founder and director of the group blog Balkanization. Professor Balkin received his Ph.D. in philosophy from Cambridge and his A.B. and J.D. degrees from Harvard. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of over 130 articles in different fields, as well as the author or editor of 14 books, including Democracy and Dysfunction, Living Originalism, and Constitutional Redemption. And I'm very happy to be discussing his most recent publication with you today, Cycles of Constitutional Time, that's published with Oxford University Press this year. So in this book, Professor Balkin examines the question of what will happen to American democracy. According to Balkin, the nation's past holds vital clues for understanding where we are now and where we are headed. In the Cycles of Constitutional Time, Professor Balkin explains how America's constitutional system changes through the interplay among three cycles. First, the rise and fall of dominant political parties. Second, the waxing and waning of political polarization. And thirdly, alternating episodes of constitutional decay and constitutional renewal. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this today. So straight into our first question. So I just wanted to really briefly read a quote from page 1, just to introduce it. So you say that there's widespread feeling that something has gone seriously wrong with constitutional democracy in the United States. The stark political and cultural polarization of American life, the raucous 2016 election, and the tabloid meanderings of the Trump presidency have only seemed to confirm a growing despair about the future of democracy in the United States. But this book takes a longer view. It argues that the malaise is only temporary. I will use tools, as you say, from constitutional theory and from political science to try to explain what is happening to American politics, how we got here, and where we're likely to be headed in the next few decades. So to start, could you talk us through the framework of the argument in your book and briefly where you in the US are currently at in the context of the cycles of constitutional time?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. You actually mentioned it in your introduction, but I'll go over it a little bit again. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about American constitutional development is because we have a presidential system with first past the post voting, and we have a federal system. The result is it's very, very hard for one party to get control of all the levers of power at one time. So if you think about a Westminster system, once you become the prime minister, your party controls parliament. And so you have control of a lot of things at once, and the minority party is largely shut out. That's not quite how it works in the United States. You can have a power within the local state governments, even if you don't have national government. You can control one branch of Congress, even if you don't control the presidency, and vice versa. The courts are lifetime tenure, which is very rare in a constitutional system. So as a result, you have these constantly shifting forces of power, which means that they don't line up all together very often. And when they do, generally what happens is you get a transformation in the assumptions of policy and politics. So this idea that there are these successive regimes in American history is crucial to one of the cycles of the book. These regimes last for a number of generations. Then they have to deal with the fact that the demographics of the country are constantly changing. There are lots of new problems they have to face. Eventually they rise, they establish dominance, and then eventually they decay. Almost immediately they start decaying, and then they fall away. And that creates the opportunity, not always taken, for another regime to take its place. There have been about 6 of these regimes in American history, starting with the Revolutionary Party, the Federalist Party, which gives way to Jefferson's party in 1800, and then there's a series of cycles. Then the Jeffersonians break apart in the 1820s, and then Andrew Jackson Democratic Party takes over. That eventually is co-opted by the forces of slavery, leading to a period of corruption, and then the Civil War, and then the Party of the Union, the Republican Party, dominates American politics for a very, very long time. They almost lose grip in 1896, but they keep going until the New Deal. And then the next regime begins with Roosevelt's Democrats, who are a transformed party at this point, completely different than the party of Jackson. And they basically keep going until about 1980, and then as a result of a whole number of different forces, of upheavals in the 60s and 70s, you get a second Republican regime, which is Ronald Reagan's regime, in which the conservative movement in America is dominant. And that is the regime we have been living through most of my adult life, really. That one is still continuing. It's near its end. So the first assertion in the book is that there are these cycles of regimes, and that the one we're in right now is nearing its end. We're not quite sure when it ends, but it seems to be greatly weakened. The second claim is that the United States, because of its two-party system and other factors, has a very, very long, undulating wave of polarization and depolarization. So you get the modern party system right around the Civil War with Democrats and Republicans. It's highly polarized at that point for obvious reasons. It stays polarized for a long time because of bitterness over the Civil War, but also because of increasing economic inequality in the first Gilded Age. And then something very interesting happens right around the turn of the 20th century. American politics begins to depolarize. That is to say, you no longer have this sort of vicious struggle between the parties. The party coalitions change, they become less ideologically coherent, and all sorts of cross-party arrangements become possible. And that's basically the middle of the 20th century, from especially the period around the New Deal, in which you basically have two or three effective different parties, although it's Democrats and Republicans. The Northern Democrats make alliance with Southern Democrats who have very different views on race and identity, but are united on issues of class. And they occasionally make deals with different parts of the Republican Party. And so much of the legislation that creates the modern regulatory, administrative and welfare state, the civil rights era, all this is produced in this period of depolarized politics. And then starting with the Voting Rights Act in '65, and really taking off with Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, you have a renewed period of polarization. And the Republican Party realizes, Newt Gingrich is the key figure here, that they can become a majority party in America, not just simply a party that occasionally wins the White House. They can take control of Congress if they engage in a deliberate strategy of political polarization around issues of identity. And they are incredibly successful at this. But one of the side effects is that the United States repolarizes, and now we're at levels of polarization, mutual distrust, and enmity we haven't seen since the Civil War. So that's where we are in that one. And then finally, a very interesting feature of American democracy is that it was designed to sort of weather periods of loss of Republican virtue and Republican organization and democracy and ride them out until there could be a chance for renewal. The founders of the United States had read Polybius, and they knew that they had also read Machiavelli and Montesquieu, and they understood that republics are very delicate and that they're always subject to corruption. And so they tried to design a system that, even if it wasn't great during the best of times, could ride out the worst of times. Whether they succeeded or not is an interesting question. I mean, it's one of the questions we're talking about today. But it's amazing how stable the Republican system has been. It fails once during the Civil War, but it has basically survived. And it's very different than the system that begins in the 1790s, but it still is the descendant of that system, and it has lots of similarities. Anyway, what happens in the American political development is you get these periods of what I call constitutional rot, in which usually accompanied by high polarization and increasing inequalities of wealth. When people lose trust in their fellow citizens, they lose trust in the government, they lose trust in institutions of society, political leaders don't trust each other and basically try to put one over on the other before the other has a chance to put one over on them. And things are terrible. I mean, this is basically what theorists of republics always feared. This is a period in which demagogues arise. You get what we would call propaganda, And they're just terrible periods. And they've happened episodically in American history. One, 1850s with the rise of the slave power. The second in the 1890s in the first Gilded Age. I think we're in the second Gilded Age. And then now in what I call the second Gilded Age. And they have lots of similarities, especially, we have a lot of similarities to our situation for the first Gilded Age. Most people don't realize this, but fake news is nothing new. The publications in the 1890s are full of fake news, just completely made up stories. There's lots of conspiracy mongering. The parties are at each other's throats. There's enormous inequalities of wealth that have been brought on by technological advancement, which has created vast fortunes, people who are richer than anyone could ever have believed, and they exercise enormous power over a democracy at this period. And people are despairing. They just don't believe democracy is going to survive. So we're at that period. So to put it all together in the book, we are at the end of a very long regime dominated by the Republican Party and conservative movement. And this is always a very confusing period. But this is much more difficult than transitions in the past. This is much more difficult than 1980 or 1932, because we have polarization like we haven't seen since the Civil War. And we're in the middle, at the depths of an area of a period of rot, constitutional rot, in which the foundations of our republic are wasting away. So it's a pretty terrible time in American democracy. And this book tries to explain what's going on. I assume that you're going to ask the next question, which is what happens next.
I will. Okay, so that's a really good time for me to read a really brief quote from page 12. So you say there, echoing what you've just said, our current political problems stem from the fact that we're in the final days of a crumbling, decadent political regime, and no new regime has yet appeared to take its place. This is a difficult and agonizing transition, a very sad time in American life. Its difficulty is enhanced by the fact that this transition between political regimes occurs at a time of peak polarization, the crest of the cycle of polarization and depolarization, and at the low point of a cycle of constitutional rot. For that reason, the transition to a new political regime is going to be very difficult, but we will get through it, and we will. And when we get through it, about 5 to 10 years from now, the present will seem like a distant, unhappy nightmare or an illness from which one has recovered. Our politics.
I wrote that before COVID, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, a political illness from which we've recovered in any case.
Yeah.
And our politics will be quite different. So I suppose I'm wondering, going into the cycles of regimes more specifically, would you like to talk a bit more about that, and then how Trump and Biden fit into that cycle and what the next cycle might look like? I know you've touched on that already.
So you have the 2020 election. It's not a repudiation, in my view, a complete repudiation of the previous regime. It may be a repudiation of Trump and the fact that he was practicing a particular form of demagogic politics, and he's completely unsuited to the job of being president. But it's not the kind of repudiation you get in earlier periods. It's not a landslide victory. Biden doesn't seem to have very much in the way of coattails. He doesn't. The Democrats lose seats in the House. They may get control of the Senate, but that depends on 2 elections in Georgia, which still haven't happened. So I think we're looking for a continuation of a relatively dysfunctional system, at least until such time as the Democratic Party is able, either the Democratic Party is able to establish itself as a majority party once again, or if Biden stumbles and the Democrats prove ineffective and they don't solve the problem of the pandemic and the economic contraction, what you'll get is a resurgence of Trumpism, which will be quite worrisome. There is an analogy to this in American history, although Trump in some ways is sui generis. The Democratic Party looked poised as a populist party. So remember, all the sides are reversed. As a populist party, right around the 1896, to basically smash the dominance of the Republican Party, the party of the Union. And they ran a populist candidate, William Jennings Bryan, who was a great orator and was also denounced as a demagogue, but certainly nothing like Trump. Bryan was a very different character. And he loses. He loses to William McKinley. And McKinley revives the Republican coalition and keeps it going for another 30 years or so. That could happen. Again, all the parties are reversed. You have to understand the populist is now the Republican Party and the Democrats are the Cosmopolitan Party. But Trump could make a comeback, or not Trump, but some other person who is an ally, a political ally of his, and keep the system going. Of course, it's a little different this time because if you keep the system going, the Trumpist model is a model that basically wrecks a republic. It's openly corrupt. It is interested in minoritarian government. It tries to restrict who can vote. It's a terrible, terrible way for a republic to develop. So, but that could happen. So we're still. I don't hate to mix metaphors, but we're still on a knife's edge. We're still waiting for what will actually occur, and we don't really know the end of the story yet. Maybe a decade from now, as I said, it suggests in the book, we'll know how the story ends. But boy, that's cold comfort to most people. Most people want to know how the story ends now. They want to go to the back of the book and find out, who won, who got married, who lived, who died, all that sort of thing.
I won't give the game away then. Yeah, so I suppose you've spoken about polarization and depolarization, but just to go through each of the cycles in a bit more depth. So you've spoken just now about the cycles of regimes. Is there anything else you want to talk about more specifically on the cycle of, or the cycles of polarization and depolarization?
I think the most important thing to watch for, as opposed to predicting, here's what to watch for. Political coalitions in the United States are constantly changing. They really are Heraclitus's river. You can't step into the same one twice. The two major parties in the United States, their coalitions have been changing very slowly over a long period of time. They're not the same coalitions that they were 20 years ago or much less 40 years ago. And each party has become different, a different version of itself. As I mentioned before, the Democratic Party used to be a labor party. Organized, its base was in the South of all places, and it was a sort of a worker party that had an alliance with the South, and it was also a civil rights party, but that comes later, and that ultimately smashes the party apart. It's not a labor party anymore. It still has support in organized labor, but organized labor has been very weakened in the last 40 years. It's much more a cosmopolitan party. It's a party of the coasts. It's a party that has a significant working class component, but the working class component is multiracial. It's a party that has attracted increasing number of educated professionals and people in suburbs, as well as its base with minorities, racial minorities. So it's a very complicated party, and I think the best way to describe it is a cosmopolitan party. It's a party of the left, but it's not a labor party in the traditional sense anymore. The Republican Party was traditionally the party of business, and it was centered in the West and also in the parts of the Northeast and the upper Midwest. That's not the party anymore. That party is now centered in the South. It's a strange combination of very, very wealthy people and white working class folks in the South and the Mountain West. It's a very strange combination. And so these two parties now have internal tensions in each other. And those internal tensions are going to change the way in which politics gets fought out. The Republican Party was incredibly successful at making the central question of American politics for the last 40 years identity. Race, religion, citizenship, ethnicity, sexual behavior. These were the questions that drove American politics and made the Republican Party the majority party. As the coalitions change, other issues will push themselves to the fore, especially issues about economic inequality and class. And as that happens, that's what you want to watch out for. That's what you want to look for. You want to see as older issues receding and newer issues replacing them. When that happens, then there is the possibility of depolarization. That's because a politics organized around identity is zero sum. I'm better, you're worse. I win, you lose. It is the kind of politics that leads to sort of Schmittian friend-enemy visions. It's not a good politics for a republic. But if you move the question to the question of class and economic power, then in fact all sorts of arrangements become possible. and all sorts of cross-party alliances become possible. So that's what you want to look for. You want to see whether that happens. I already see that the party coalitions are becoming incoherent. That's obvious to me, but maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part. We'll see what happens in the next decade or so.
Yeah, okay. So because you say that polarization moves in cycles and that politics in America will eventually depolarize. I mean, where do you think that the US is in this current moment in terms of a move towards depolarization?
Yes, I think that we are very slowly moving there, but it's very hard to see.
Yeah.
Because if you think about American politics, it's so deeply fractured. People really don't trust each other. And polarization is tied. When you add polarization to deep wealth inequality, you get rot. That's what we have right now.
Yeah.
And so the real question is whether or not we can hold out long enough for changes in coalitions of politics to reform the central questions of American politics. As long as the central question of American politics are about identity, and then in fact it's just going to get worse, because you can't compromise on identity. There are other things you can compromise on, but not that.
So you've spoken a lot over the years about this talk of constitutional crisis in the US, and you've dismissed that on several occasions, that the US is in a state of constitutional crisis, but that it's living in a period of constitutional rush. How do you foresee constitutional renewal emerging in the US? And again, do you have any idea when is this likely to take form, or is that impossible to predict too?
Well, I mean, I said a little bit about how I think renewal might happen. It might happen when party coalitions change. Unfortunately, I have to say, renewal in American politics is often accompanied by destruction and sometimes catastrophe. So that's very sad, because if you think about the previous periods, you have the Civil War, destroys an enormous amount of wealth and basically shakes the foundations of American politics. And then in the 1890s, what you have is you have a series of panics, economic depressions, and then you have 2 world wars and a Great Depression, which basically break the back of the inequality that was strangling American politics. That's not a great way to solve the problems of a country, I should just say. And you have to hope that there's a more peaceful way of basically doing it. Whether or not some combination of the pandemic and economic contraction will play a key role, we just don't know. But I do want to say a little bit about crisis.
Yeah.
So I have a relatively, Sandy Levinson, my longtime friend and co-author, had a theory of crises. And the basic theory is this: what's a constitution for? A constitution serves lots of goals. It protects human rights. It divides power. It separates power. It has systems of representation. But our view is that the most basic purpose of a constitution is to make politics possible. That is, it's a platform in which people can engage in politics. And a constitutional crisis is the moment at which people reasonably believe that the system for maintaining politics is about to fail. And then what you get is you get violence, not just sporadic violence. You get civil war, you get insurrection, you get the overthrow of government. So when people talk about constitutional crisis, often what they really mean is either political crisis, which happens all the time, or they mean rot, which is what the book is about. But generally speaking, constitutional crises in the United States are relatively rare. I mean, we had constitutional failure once. There are periods in which people imagine that Nixon won't surrender the tapes in the Watergate scandal, and he will defy a direct order from the Supreme Court. That would have been a constitutional crisis, but it didn't happen. He gives up the tapes. At various points, people feared that Trump would announce that he was just not going to play by the rules of American constitutionalism, but he hasn't yet. He's going to leave. At least he says he's going to leave on January 20th, and even if he doesn't want to leave, it doesn't matter, because the moving trucks will show up. So it doesn't look like we have a constitutional crisis right now in the United States. But believe me, in the last 4 years, there are any number of op-eds and very smart people who have predicted that we are in a constitutional crisis. But I think often they're confusing crisis with political crisis, which we have been in, or with rot, which, yes, we have been in as well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so Connor has a question for you. Dr. Connor Casey is Max Weber Postdoctoral Fellow at the European University Institute. He did his undergrad and doctoral studies at Trinity College School of Law and has a master's from Yale Law School. So go ahead, Connor, whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Donna and Professor Balkin. So one of the just fascinating things about American constitutional culture is just the sheer variety of approaches to judicial review. Everything from judicial supremacy to departmentalism, theory and deference, and everything, popular constitutionalism, everything in between in different modes of interpretation. So I was just wondering, the current situation is you have a very strong Supreme Court with a very assertive sense of its own dominant role in constitutional interpretation, very willing to invalidate landmark statutes, nearly struck down a signature policy of Barack Obama. Just wondering what is that going to look like under the new regime, whether it's a Democratic-led regime or some kind of Republican Party with a more fiscally left, more sanguine about redistribution and things and promoting working class issues. What is that Supreme Court going to look like? Are we going to see a sort of replication of the showdown between FDR and the four horsemen who were wedded to the traditional understanding of commerce, power, and things like that? Are we going to see another showdown when those two things collide?
Okay, so let's take this up with the two alternatives you offered. Let's start with the possibility of a Trumpist resurgence. So if there's a Trumpist resurgence, then I suspect that you will find that the judiciary works pretty well with the majority party. And I doubt very much that a Trumpist regime will be a party of the left on economics. In fact, I think everything suggests that it will just be increasingly corrupt and it will engage in upward redistribution of wealth and income. This court doesn't seem to be very concerned about upward redistribution of wealth and income. If anything, it's the Roberts Court. I mean, obviously we have a bunch of new justices. The Roberts Court has basically aided and abetted increases in inequality and wealth in the United States in the last 20 years. I don't see there'll be a big change. I don't see, in other words, I don't think the new justices are likely to be economic egalitarians. They mostly won't care. They'll mostly care about identity issues, religion, guns, affirmative action, abortion. Those will be the major concerns. And the reason why is because you understand, with life tenure, the judiciary is always a lagging indicator of trends in American politics. So in other words, even if American politics eventually depolarizes, which I very much hope it does, the judiciary is likely to be very polarized for some period of time because these people were appointed by politicians in highly polarized environments. So I think that's what happens if you have a Trumpist regime. I also think that the independence of the courts will be increasingly at risk, but not because the justices, fight very much, but rather because it'll be, there will be a considerable mind meld between the justices appointed, the Trumpist justices, and the direction of the Republican Party. I mean, there are limits. There will be limits to what the judges will put up with, but for the most part, most of the policies they'll accept. We saw, for example, that when Donald Trump tried to pull a fast one on the federal courts with respect to wild claims of fraud in voting, the judges on the Third Circuit said, "No, that's crazy. Come on, we have procedural rules here. Don't try and put one over on us." So they won't put up with everything, but for the most part, it will be, they'll have a modus vivendi. What happens if you get the resurgence of a new democratic regime, or more specifically, what happens in the presidency of Joe Biden over the next several years? And the answer is, I suspect that Biden will just simply make do with a very powerful court because he doesn't really have many more cards to play at this point. He'll face very stern opposition in the Senate to appoint new judges unless he gets a majority in the Senate. He probably won't be able to, he'll find great difficulty basically resisting what the court does. So he'll probably relate to the court much in the same way that Barack Obama did. He'll complain, but there won't be much he can do about it. If it turns out that the Democrats are able to win a sizable majority and really establish themselves as a dominant party, well, then what you'll get is a period of departmentalism, as you got with Roosevelt and with Reagan and with Jackson and so forth. But it won't last because departmentalism doesn't last. Keith Whittington's book on the politics of judicial supremacy shows that departmentalism is something that it's like adolescence. It's a phase you go through. As soon as the new administration is able to appoint a bunch of new judges and justices, they get along with them just fine because they'll be cooperating with them. So I suspect that's what's likely to happen. The real question has to do with how the party coalitions work over the next decade or so. I suspect Joe Biden is going to find that he can't really get all that much done with respect to the courts until the relative balance of power between the party changes.
Thanks so much, Professor Balkin, and thanks, Connor. And there is some time if you wanted to ask any either of the other questions that you had, Connor, or would you prefer to move on? Just unmute yourself there. Thanks.
I just have one question because I'm a big fan, Professor Balkin, of your scholarship with Sanford Levinson on constitutional dictatorship. I thought that was a fantastic piece. And I was just wondering, so Kagan's prediction or declaration in 2000, very famous piece in the Harvard Law Review about presidential administration, congressional gridlock leading to presidents essentially stretching their statutory authority and constitutional authority to govern through the bureaucracy, essentially. I think that's played out descriptively. I don't think maybe normatively she would think it's been all that great. Right. But do you see that continuing and becoming more aggressive, or just
Yes, and there you're likely to see interesting showdowns with a conservative court. So as you may know, there has been rumblings among conservative legal intelligentsia, and to some degree the federal judges, that they think that the administrative state has gotten too big for its britches and it needs to be scaled back. And judges need to be more active in reviewing and policing what administrative agencies do. I think that with a Biden presidency, those tendencies will only increase. And we're likely to see changes in administrative law, which give administrative agencies somewhat less discretion. And so what you'll see is a series of collisions not between Congress and the president so much, but between the judiciary and the president over the administrative state.
Thank you. That's great. So I see a few questions and questions in the Q&A box there. I'm just wondering, before we move into the Q&A, Professor Balkin, is there anything further you'd like to say around judicial review? Because I know the second half of the book deals with that in a lot of detail, and we've spoken about the cycles, but is there anything you wanted to add before we move on in relation to judicial review?
Well, I could say a little bit about it, but in the book, I point out that how people feel about judicial review is not unrelated to where they are in political time, the cycles, and it's not unrelated to which party happens to have control of the judiciary. So when a new regime usually comes into being, it usually hasn't appointed most of the judges and justices, and therefore it's rather skeptical of judicial review, and therefore you get arguments for judicial restraint. As time goes on, and as I said before, as you appoint more judges and justices that are roughly in sync with your views about the world, then judicial review starts to become very useful. And so politicians tend to like it. And as you get near the end of a regime, you'll see that the dominant party that's appointed most of the judges and justices loves judicial review and thinks very highly of it. So this is what we've seen. The Republican Party loves judicial review. They call it, they don't call it judicial activism. That's what they said when Democrats controlled the courts. They call it judicial engagement. And they're very much in favor of judicial engagement. And what happens is the party that's on the outs basically is very skeptical of judicial review, and legal intellectuals basically come up with all sorts of schemes for how to restrain the courts. That's happened many times in American history. It also turns out that for people like me who dabble in constitutional theories of interpretation, turns out theories of interpretation also have this character. They tend to go through these cycles of how you feel about courts, whether you want strong courts or weak courts. And the two reigning theories in America, living constitutionalism and originalism, have both gone through these cycles. Each has been through a period in which it's about judicial restraint, and then has moved on to a period in which which it basically is a justification for strong judicial review. So I suspect this will continue, at least right now where we are. Originalism, which is the standard view among conservative legal intellectuals, is allied with strong judicial review, even though you get occasional feints in the direction of no judicial activism. In fact, originalist judges today don't really care all that much about judicial activism. They just want to enforce what they regard as the original meaning of the Constitution, which may have something, but often nothing to do with the original meaning of the Constitution.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So Dr. Surya Roy is an assistant professor with us here at the School of Law, and he has a question there. So he says, does Professor Balkin buy into the Tom Ginsburg project on constitutionalism by numbers or predicting the lifespan of constitutions? Per Ginsburg, as a rule of thumb, easily amendable and detailed constitutions endure longer. How do you feel about that?
Well, obviously, I tend to be eclectic in my in how I think about research. So whenever Tom Ginsburg writes something, I always pay attention to it. The second question, the second part of the question was, could you repeat that again?
Yes,
about the idea of a particular conclusion?
Of course. So Per Ginsburg, as a rule of thumb, easily amendable and detailed constitutions endure longer, and participation in constitutional design and amendment is key. And he says, can the Constitution be saved by adopting the Irish referendum system of constitutional amendment, i.e.
Well, it's not, obviously the American Constitution is the big exception to the idea that detailed constitutions last longer.
Yeah.
But if you look at state constitutions in the United States, they are much closer to most of the constitutions in the world. They're long and detailed, and they have lots of features in them that you'd see in constitutions elsewhere. So it just happens to be an illusion created by our federal system. My very dear friend Sandy Levinson is a great believer in direct democracy, and his view is that we should adopt some kind of direct democracy in the United States. I am basically, I have no problem with direct democracy at the state level. I am not sure how direct democracy would work at the national level, honestly. I mean, it's very tempting, and certainly to smash through impediments in our national system. That is one of the appeals of direct democracy. The only problem is, this is a conversation I've had with Sandy over the years, I'm also worried that in times when demagogues are afoot, direct democracy is a very dangerous thing. And unfortunately, even if direct democracy would be a great idea in the United States, since we are right in the middle of Trumpism, it does not seem to me that it is the best time to do direct democracy at the national level. I mean, in fact, one of the largest problems we face with constitutional reform, and this is also the debate that Sandy and I have in our book, Democracy and Dysfunction, is that Sandy's proposals for constitutional amendment and constitutional conventions occur at a time of extreme party polarization, which makes effective conventions difficult. So I have argued that we are in desperate need of constitutional reform in the United States, but that much of this will have to be done sub-constitutionally, that is through legislation and through the creation of new practices. And much of it will have to be done at the state level. Because actually the states in many cases have healthier systems than we do at the national level.
That makes sense. And thanks, Surya, for the question. Gavin Barrett is a professor in University College Dublin, also has a question. So he says he's really enjoying the seminar, and thank you. Professor Balkin, what you have had to say analyzes what has happened as a US phenomenon, but is this model exportable? Is Europe undergoing a similar, hopefully transient cycle right now, represented by the Brexit vote and the rise of a more authoritarian model of government in some Central European states? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, at the beginning of the book, I say that I think that what happens, often things that happen in Europe also happen in the United States, that the same larger forces do it, but the way that the American democracy processes them is often quite different. And there's a discussion of that, and I give a whole bunch of historical examples of how the same things happen, and yet the way the Americans process it is different than the way that it gets processed in Europe. I think the same is true today. That is, it's also important to understand Part of our problems come from our federal and presidential system with a very specific representational system, first past the post. Lots of European democracies have very different systems of representation, and they're parliamentary. So how these things play out will be different, just for that reason alone. But there are a couple things that do seem to be similar. So in other words, if you understand that this is all going to be filtered through different representational systems, and therefore the results may be different, what do they have in common? Well, the economic upheavals that happened in the United States in 2008 and then affected the Eurozone, that's common. And the Eurozone crises, which are not still resolved to this day and may have many aftershocks, that's also the case. And the United States is having economic problems. Secondly, the transformation of traditionally labor parties, like the Democratic Party and the British Labour Party, into cosmopolitan parties that have assimilated large numbers of immigrants and are now multiracial cosmopolitan parties. That seems to occur not just in the United States, but in other parts of Europe. And that has given rise to anti-immigrant, anti-cosmopolitan, anti-intellectual, anti-science parties in the United States and also in Europe as well. So those things seem to be common. And those are terrible preconditions for successful democratic politics over the long run. I mean, both those things are very worrisome. But how this will work itself out in the United States and Europe is going to be different, because the one thing we haven't mentioned so far is the role of the European Union. So right now, as you know, the European Union is engaged in a kind of contest of wills with Hungary and Poland, and over what it will do about the fact that Hungary and Poland have become increasingly anti-democratic is too strong a word, but basically democracy has decayed in those two countries. Well, the United States doesn't have anything quite like that problem. And so the way it works out in Europe will very much depend on how the European Union chooses to deal with the rise of these tendencies.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Gavin, for the question. Robert Bornholt asks, what prospect do you see for the project of some Trumpists to move to a presidential supremacy model like the de Gaulle constitution or the project of integralism or the Putin system in Russia? Any thoughts on any of that?
Wow, those are three different ways to go. So I tend to think that none of these is likely to happen. The closest is the de Gaulle model. That is very, very strong presidency. It's overdetermined by the fact that that conservative intellectuals in the United States like strong presidencies, that in a period of dysfunction and polarization, it's very hard for Congress to do very much, and therefore the president becomes ever more powerful. And if the president is allied with the judiciary, that is, the president picks a lot of judges who kind of see the world the way the president does, then the president has a freer hand. So that model could work. The only thing that's ironic about it is that Donald Trump doesn't seem to have been a very strong president. He seems to have been a rather weak president. Now, Sandy Levinson and I, in our article on constitutional dictatorship, mentioned that one thing that's very odd about American presidentialism is that it has what we might call a distributed dictatorship. That is, there are lots of these people in different parts of the government. Trump denounced them as the deep state, but they seem to have the power to basically make a whole bunch of decisions about different things. And that seems to be a curious feature of American presidentialism, that although the official story is the unitary executive, right? The president's at the top and he gives orders to everyone and they do what he says. In fact, the actual practice is much more distributed and more complicated. So it may well be that the facade is de Gaullist, is that of de Gaulle, that is the all-powerful president. And therefore you have a charismatic presidency, which basically asserts its centrality, but the actual practices might be different. And this sort of frisson between the public face of the presidency and the actual operations of the presidency is a very curious feature of American politics. As for Putinism, no, I don't think that's where we're going. What was the third alternative?
integralism?
No, I think, see, integralism requires a dominant religious minority, dominant religious majority that can more or less have its way in politics. And that doesn't seem to be the fate of the United States right now.
Yeah.
So you have a strong religious minority that is trying to have its way in politics, but that's not the same thing as the conditions necessary for integralism.
Great.
But I do want to say that Americans are scavengers. We very much just take ideas from lots of different places and we combine them and we turn them into something else that nobody ever imagined. I mean, think about American food. It's just like a melange of different things from different countries. We just turn it into something that's very American. So I think what will happen is you'll get ideas from integralism and they'll basically be taken, in a sort of random fashion and mixed with other conservative mobilizations and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, the idea of the public good, the common good,
yeah.
which is an integralist idea, boy, I suspect that one's going to get a lot of play in the next several years. It's overdetermined, the pandemic and conservative movements and all that. So that's an idea that will probably be taken from integralism, but the rest of it probably won't be taken over.
Yeah, great, thank you. Sean Darcy says, brilliant expose, Professor Balkin, thank you so much. Are US citizens very different historically compared with now, as you assert that this is the worst period since the Civil War? Are they more prone to current influences than previously with the rise of tech companies, etc.? If the USA system continues to throw up these types of regimes, should it not change to a different system, and how possible is this? And what about economic conditions now versus historically? Will the Democrats, left-leaning politicians like AOC potentially undermine the Biden presidency? And yeah, well, I'll leave it there. It's a long question.
A whole bunch of different questions. Can we break them down? One seemed to be about technology. One was about technology and one was about the Democratic Party. I forgot what the first one was.
I mean, your areas of expertise is on technology, isn't it? So, I mean, if you wanted to take that one, are the citizens of the US more influenced than previously with the rise of tech companies?
No, I tend to think that that's not quite what's going on. The term yellow journalism, which is basically newspapers publishing all sorts of crazy stuff just to sell papers, that's from the late 19th century. You have partisan presses throughout most of American history, and the crazy things they'll say about people, you just can't believe. Just go back and see what people said about each other. I don't think that's the problem. Also, remember that the United States is more educated. The public is more educated than it was through most of its history. So I don't think that's the problem, but I do think tech companies are problematic for the following reason. This is my other body of work, the work that I do on the digital public sphere. The basic problem, as I see it, is that you have too small a number of technology companies that control the digital public sphere, and they cannot actually serve their appropriate social function because they're too large and because they're buffeted about by lots of different systems, and whether they like it or not, they have an outsized effect on the structure of politics, not only in the United States, but in many other countries where politicians really don't have the power to push back at all. So that's a problem, not only for the United States, but it's a problem around the world. We would be much better off if there were lots and lots and lots of social media companies, each of which had different rule sets. And this is a 1990s idea from the early days of the internet, each of which had different moderation policies, each of which was more able to deal with questions of content moderation. It would also be better if at the same time we had interoperability systems that allowed people to subscribe to multiple social media companies and therefore have like feeds. I have a feed of lots of different social media companies that you could subscribe to, and that would have interesting effects both in terms of competition, but also in terms of ameliorating some of the worst excesses of the current system. What we have now is kind of the worst of all possible worlds. We have siloed social media systems that are not interoperable, and we have huge ones, a small number of really huge ones, and all of the economic incentives are toward exacerbating problems of democratic discourse. So I have pointed out on a number of occasions that, to take Facebook, one half of Facebook is deeply devoted to the public interest. There are all these people who are very, very serious about, moderating in the public interest. And then the other half, so they put out fires. That's what they do. They put out fires. The other half of Facebook is devoted to starting fires. So that is no way to run a digital public sphere, to have the largest and most influential system for the discussion of public events be schizophrenic in this way. And therefore, I think it's really important to have reforms. And that affects not only the United States, it affects every part of the world.
Thanks so much. I'm going to bring in one last question. We can't ask them all, but Professor Oren Doyle is on, and I'm just going to promote you to panelist, Professor Doyle, but don't worry if you don't have a camera or anything like that. I think Professor Doyle is a professor of constitutional law in Trinity Law School and was a student of yours in Harvard years ago. So if you would like to unmute and ask your question, or if you prefer, I can ask it for you. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So I'm not sure why I've been given this privilege, but I think Donna is just allowing me to say hi. Because,
maybe it's because you have a nice face. That's the reason.
That could be it. But yeah, it's 20 years ago now since I took your class during your visit to Harvard on constitutional equality laws, and really enjoyed the class and really enjoyed the seminar this evening or this afternoon. So my question is, I'm just wondering, are there features in the US situation at present which may make it difficult to break out of this regime or difficult to move on to a new cycle? I'm thinking about, you talk about the Supreme Court as a lagging indicator, but maybe it's no longer a lagging indicator, or the lag is considerably longer than it used to be for various reasons. The Democrats seem to need to win the popular presidential vote by around 3-4 million in order to win the Electoral College. They face headwinds in the House and the Senate for very different reasons. So they may, I'm not endorsing this, they may feel the system is stacked against them. And I'm wondering, was it like that in earlier cycles? And might this make them move to a new regime more difficult?
Well, so here's the bad news. The bad news is that we're kind of in a race against time. That is to say, can party coalitions shift and elections be held in such a way as to allow sub-constitutional reforms that can ameliorate some of the problems of representation? As the things you just pointed out, the malapportionment of the Senate, the role of money in politics, which actually has gotten better because the Democrats have found ways to respond to it. The role of the courts in supporting minoritarian government. There are lots of different things to be concerned about. There's many ways in which the current regime is trying to stay alive by entrenching itself through a minoritarian regime and shrinking the size of the electorate and basically making majoritarian turnover of power difficult, rotation in office difficult. Yes, everything you said is correct, and it is the big problem we face. And the question is whether or not you can get a sufficient democratic upheaval against it to basically create the possibility for reform. That's the problem. And the answer is we don't know. I mean, as I said, we'd really like to go to the back of the book and see what happened in the last chapter, but we're just not there yet. We just don't know the answer. Has it ever happened before? Oh yeah. I mean, the United States has a myth of being a very democratic system. It hasn't been democratic through most of its history. It's had all sorts of skewed problems of representation throughout most of its history. Not to harp too much on the Civil War again, but because of the 3/5 clause in the American Constitution, which allowed Southern states to count 3/5 of their slaves for representational purposes, the South had a sort of representational hammerlock on the White House and on the judiciary as a result, and on the passage of legislation that might affect the economic interests of slavery. And so that is a characteristic feature of the early republic. And when the party that becomes the Republican Party in 1854, called Republican because it's trying to preserve a republic, it complains about the deleterious effects of what it calls the slave power on the chances for an effective republic. And during the first Gilded Age, you have the same concerns that you have a unrepresentative system. And indeed, in the 1960s, you have concerns about the fact the United States is unrepresentative. Earl Warren, very famous American Chief Justice, once was asked what is his greatest achievement as Chief Justice. You would think he would have said Brown versus Board of Education, very famous case that symbolizes equality, racial equality in the United States. Instead, the answer he gave was the apportionment cases, the cases that basically required the one person, one vote system and reapportioned state representation. And the reason why is he thought that was more crucial to the long-term health of the American system than almost anything else. And he may well have been right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Oren. So we have run out of time. I'm sorry, Gerardo and Michael, you have a couple of really good questions there, but I will pass them on to Professor Balkin afterwards. So I will just wrap up, and I would like to say an absolutely huge thank you to Professor Balkin for attending and sharing your valuable insights, and also to everyone else for attending and for excellent questions. As you know, you're a prolific writer and influential thinker, and the book touches on important issues relating to constitutional governance, democracy, rule of law, all crucial debates at this challenging time, but it also offers a message of hope and positive reflection for the future of constitutionalism in the US. So I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for all of these excellent insights. It's been a real privilege and an honor to speak with you. And this is a really important discussion. I've no doubt it will be widely viewed and very much appreciated by the wider audience afterwards. Is there anything else you wanted to mention or bring in or touch on that we haven't dealt with yet, Professor Balkin?
I just wanted to thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much again. And with that, I'll close the session. Thank you.